Well, hello and welcome to another online Bible study with Pastor Bill Brown. We're continuing on in our series in the book of Proverbs, instructional Proverbs, this time regarding feeding or eating on Proverbs. I'd probably expand that, eating on Proverbs or feasting on Proverbs. It is a good thing to feast on the Word of God, and that's exactly what you can do in the book of Proverbs. And I want to encourage you to do that. And we're going to look first at one verse in Proverbs 13 and 25, where it says, "The righteous eateth to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want." The wide-ranging area of wisdom that's throughout the book of Proverbs is absolutely amazing in the areas that it speaks to. It is, of course, a divine resource, but it's also the wisdom of Solomon that God gave to him. And he speaks a lot about a lot of things. Food and drink, coupled with social behavior or with the attitude, is a common subject, matter of fact, in the book of Proverbs. He uses it to teach wisdom and knowledge and understanding. So I'm going to focus on that idea of eating, feeding on and in Proverbs, not only upon the Proverbs themselves, but what do the Proverbs say about eating? What can we discover? And I'm going to try to show you, first of all, the imagery of eating in the book of Proverbs. Then we'll talk about the influence of eating in the book of Proverbs. And by that too, I'm going to talk about the literal facts of what food does. And then lastly, the icons of biblical eating or biblical foods. And we'll take a little peek at that and see what we can learn. First of all, in dealing with the imagery of eating, and the idea that when I began to look through this of eating, thirsting, hungering, feasting, all of these words will help us to understand and receive some sort of wisdom that's being taught. And in this particular text, you can see the imagery of being satisfied with eating for one man, while the belly of the other still has a want or a desire. But really the contrast is about an attitude. It's the attitude of the righteous and the wicked. Now, most of us might begin with either the type of food or the quantity or even the quality of food, which would lead us to being satisfied or dissatisfied. How many times have we gone to a restaurant and they might even ask you to fill out something of how content were you, how satisfied were you with the service, the quality of the food, and so on. Well, here wisdom is taught about who is doing the eating, not really what is being eaten or even how much. The imagery, the associations, and the truth taught in this category throughout Proverbs and about this subject, it really is worth the search and the diligent study. The use of imagery to teach spiritual wisdom can be very enlightening. I, in fact, have found at least 54 verses, and I kept changing that number as I studied, kept going up and up. 54 verses in Proverbs that use food, drink, eating, feeding, drinking, thirsting, hungering, or even harvesting to teach something incredibly wise. And if you do it, you may find more than I find. I quit after 54 verses, and if I didn't find something else after that, I wasn't going to keep on looking. It's very laborious, but it's interesting to begin to divide those 54 verses. And as I did so, I found that the majority are used exclusively to draw an image which teaches wisdom through some literal or familiar act of eating or feasting or hungering or thirsting. All of us hunger, and we are familiar with having a satisfying meal. But we're also probably very familiar with a meal that does not bring contentment or leaves us still desiring more, or certainly something different. I can remember being told as a child what we were going to have that evening, and I had no desire for that meal. Well, Solomon is really teaching us in this verse how the ungodly or the wicked have an insatiable appetite. They're full of covetousness. In fact, you can see it in elsewhere where he says the eyes of man are never satisfied. The natural man is always looking for more because he is always and only looking for the temporal. And it's only when he tastes of God that he will ever learn true satisfaction. That's why the righteous man, we can say, has been blessed with the presence of God. He has been made righteous and now looks at things through God's eyes and values things God puts a priority upon. The righteous literally find contentment in God and in the provisions of God. He can feast upon the bread of heaven. The wicked are fed only upon the things of this world. So no wonder he's always and never satisfied. He remains hungry. The difference in that first verse that we mentioned, that we looked at, the idea of the righteous eating to the satisfying of his soul, but the belly of the wicked shall want. When we look at that, we learn that the difference is in attitude, but it's also a difference in what is satisfied, or which remains satisfied, and who remains hungry. The righteous man's soul is satisfied. And that, of course, is contrasted with the belly, or that fleshly desire of the wicked. I see, and hope you can, very clearly the picture of the spiritual and the natural man. The man who hates knowledge and did not choose to fear the Lord. What does it say about them in that same chapter, chapter 1? They that hated knowledge did not choose to fear the Lord. Look at verse 31. It says, they, therefore, shall they eat of the fruit of their own way and be filled with their own devices. It talks about in Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 17 that they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. That bread of wickedness is deceiving. Though it may taste sweet to the natural man, Proverbs says that later it will fill your mouth full of gravel. It will bring remorse. Why? Because it destroys, it distresses, and it will be despised in the end, that bread of wickedness. We need to learn what wisdom says to us when it says in Proverbs 9 and 5, come eat of my bread and drink of the wine which I have mingled. The imagery of feasting upon the bread and wine of wisdom comes without danger. It comes without limitations. Wisdom provides a fully furnished table. We'll look at that verse at the end, but you go look at Proverbs 9 and in there. Wisdom provides a fully furnished table that will always satisfy. That's what Proverbs does. Feast on it and learn to be satisfied from it. On the other hand, in that same chapter, at the end of that chapter 9, you find the foolish woman, and verses 13 through 18, and in particular, verse 17, where she promises that stolen waters are sweet and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But we find out that those promises are empty. If you turn into her table, she's begging you, come into her table, you will find there only the dead and only those whose end is hell. It's your choice. Feed at the table of wisdom or feed at the table of the foolish woman. The imagery of eating in this book of Proverbs is abundant. We could talk about the slothful, an idle soul will suffer hunger. Those who love the power of the tongue, it says, will eat the fruit thereof. And of course, it talks about the lips of the righteous feed many. Look for them and learn from them as you read your daily dose of Proverbs. You will be blessed beyond measure. Now I want to talk about the influence of eating. And we're going to use for that Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 3, where it says, when thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. Be not desirous of his dainties, for they are deceitful meat. You know, what does that tell us? And there's more in that chapter about that. But what it's teaching us is that people use food and feast to often create an atmosphere and help to remove obstacles or to help achieve a particular end. Some in my day and age called it wining and dining. There was an end, an aim for that meal. Proverbs teaches us how we ought to behave in such situations. This is not figurative. In fact, the only thing figurative in that particular part of that scripture is putting a knife to your throat. You don't put a literal knife to your throat. But what it is teaching us is that food and drink, along with festivities, can have some immediate negative effects on our body and our mind. We can be swayed, we can be plied away from one position to another because of the ornateness of the feast or the food. The effect, though, Solomon tells us, ought to be caution. Solomon knew this challenge firsthand, and he offers his wisdom. When thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently, pay attention. Though we may never be invited by a ruler to their table, we may be invited to a table and to festivities that are prepared with an agenda. Wisdom applied here gives us caution to consider diligently what is before you. The idea does not mean that only are you referring to look at the types of food, but the purpose of the meat and the dainties. It looks at and tells you to look at the motive of the meal. Some meals are just great fellowship, and those are the best kind, but some come with an agenda. It also refers to and speaks to our behavior and what impression our behavior will give to our host and to others. We are not to allow the lawfulness of eating in luxury and eating the luxurious to overcome our need to restrain ourselves. Do not let, in other words, the pleasures of the flesh overwhelm your natural weakness. Maybe that's exactly why, because you're a man given to appetite, they aimed at your appetite because that's where you're weak at, and you're going to be more inclined to be fashioned upon and looking at that food rather than the conversation. Let it be a flag to your mind, and consider the flattery, the favors, and even the feebleness of yourself before you eat. The extra caution found here is for those of us who are easily influenced by food, more likely than others will be influenced. That means that there are times when these plies of someone else may not work on you so well. Some are more, again, made pliable by food, more moved by it than others will be. And again, the only imagery used here is if you're that kind of person, then put a knife to your throat. Have some extra caution. Be aware that this table may be covered with food, but it also, that food may be filled with the poison of deceit. Remember, Proverbs also tells us that the riches that are offered with this meal may, in fact, like Proverbs 23:5 says, make themselves wings and fly away. The allure of the atmosphere, the fine foods, the expansive and expensive menu, and the host encouragement to eat and drink, my friend, should be looked at with great caution. Look and study the rest of that Proverbs in 23 verses 6 and 7. They may be using food and luxurious surroundings to seduce, to entice, or to just simply break down your inhibitions and normal cautions. Proverbs says, wisdom says, consider all of this diligently. If you're given to an appetite, put a knife to your throat. Be reminded, like we learned already in Proverbs 15 and verse 17, that a traveler's meal of simple herbs where love is better than a grand meal served with hatred or deceit. Remember, Proverbs 17 and 1 says, better is a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of sacrifices with strife. Better are the conversation of pleasant words than the sweet dainties of deceit. Proverbs 16 and 24 says that pleasant words, are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. And that leads me to our last point, beyond the imagery, beyond the influence. I called this the icons of eating. It's just that verse and the word, the idea of honeycomb, how that it's sweet to the soul and health to the bones, ought to cause our minds to begin to see some and think about and ponder some biblical icons of eating and drinking. In Proverbs alone, without going anywhere else in the scriptures, you'll find the word bread used 14 times. You'll find the word milk. I'm using words that we're commonly familiar with, used elsewhere in the scriptures. Milk used twice. Wine is used 10 times. Olive oil, or just oil, 3 times. Meat 5 times, and the honeycomb 3 times. And all of these, the bread, the milk, the wine, the oil, the meat, and honeycomb, are certainly iconic, and everyone is familiar with them. Most of you can probably identify how they are used in other books, and even some famous verses which use them in their imagery and teach something by their literal fact of a spiritual truth. I mean, how iconic is honey, for instance? John the Baptist came eating locust and honey. And Jesus, after his resurrection, ate fish and honeycomb. Well, here in Proverbs, look at chapter 24 and verse 13. My son, eat thou honey, because it is good. There's the literal fact again. It's not imagery. It's a fact that honey is good, and honeycomb, which is sweet to thy taste. But he also gives a caution. In Proverbs 25 and 16, he says, hast thou found honey? Eat so much as is sufficient. And stop there. Sufficient for thee. lest thou be filled therewith and vomit it. We know what that is. He is giving us the encouragement that yes, we have liberty to eat that honey and that honeycomb, but don't take that too far. Too much of a good thing is not good for you. Wisdom teaches us the principle of moderation in all things is always prudent. He used the iconic honey to illustrate this point. Solomon compares this lack of constraint and bad end of eating way too much honey to those who seek their own glory. It won't end well. It's not good to eat much honey. The same way it is that men to search for their own glory is not glory. So if we were to ask, which should you eat? Processed sugar or honey, natural? Divine wisdom tells us that the honeycomb is profitable to our body's health, but it also gives us the guidelines and rules of moderation. Another icon of the Bible is certainly wine. Wine is a drink that can bring forth both health and harm. Proverbs 31 and verse 6 says, give strong drink unto him that is ready to perish, and wine unto those that be of heavy hearts. Wine is said to make the heart of man glad in Psalm 104 and verse 15. It helps man, it says, forget his poverty. But we learn in Proverbs 20 and verse 1 that wine is also a mocker. It soothes the aching mind, but then if you do not use it carefully, it slowly overcomes you before you ever notice. Wine may make one glad, but it can also impoverish, and as the scriptures say, it can bite like a serpent and sting like an adder. Through the Proverbs, you will find images, influences, and icons relating to food, eating, and hunger. But I want to end and leave you with one last food. Eating at one of the most famous restaurants in the world, or dining on some of the most exquisite and expensive foods, may be something you're interested in. But I think better yet, we need to ask God to feed us with food that is convenient for me. Proverbs 30 and verse 8 says, remove far from me vanity and lies. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me. Now that's a wisdom that's only going to be found in the Bible. And it can speak volumes to us concerning our spiritual appetites and attitudes. The food convenient for me is specialized. It is personalized, and it should be iconic or become iconic to us. The word convenient comes from the Hebrew word meaning portion. Enlarged, it would mean the food that has been appointed for me, my portion. Our prayer should be that we are looking to be content with the portion of God's providence that supplies us with our most basic and necessary needs, our food. Ask God for neither poverty nor riches, but ask for the Spirit in you of finding satisfaction with the provisions of your God. Feed me, Lord, with the appointed provisions, and teach me to be content with those provisions. This study has been encouraging to me, and I hope encouraging to you. I'm also going to just leave you with one last little funny. I would hope that God even uses the iconic making of butter to teach some wisdom. It is an absolute and indisputable fact that the churning of milk bringeth forth butter. Wisdom tells us that strife is made in the same way. Stir the pot, infuriate and irritate the passions of another man, and you will bring forth strife. Surely the churning of milk bringeth forth butter, and the wringing of the nose bringeth forth blood. So the forcing of wrath, stirring up those passions, infuriating, will bring strife. Wisdom tells us that we ought to avoid controversies and contentions. Oftentimes things are said and we have got to respond. We need to learn to let it go. Keep it to yourself, or else you will find the butter of rage flavor with fury. Feed on Proverbs, and don't be deceived by the dainty meats of those who have an ill motive. Wisdom has prepared her meats. She has mingled her wines. She has baked her breads. And she says, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine which I have mingled." She promises that her meal is both delicious and profitable. I encourage you to feed on Proverbs and enjoy the taste of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. May the Lord bless you in your studies. Amen.